I was teaching geography when the war came for me. Not loudly, not dramatically. It arrived quietly, like most dangerous things do. One moment I was explaining river systems to a room full of restless children, chalk dust clinging to my fingers, sunlight pouring through tall windows. The next, I was being asked questions that had nothing to do with maps and everything to do with borders people were dying to protect. At first, I didn't understand why they had chosen me. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't trained to fight. I had never fired a weapon. I was a woman who taught children where countries began and ended. That, apparently, was exactly the point. They came for me after school hours. 2 men. Polite. Unremarkable. The kind you forget moments after meeting. They waited until the classroom was empty, then closed the door gently behind them. "Miss Hayes," one said, "we'd like to talk." I remember the way his eyes moved, not nervously, but carefully, measuring the room, the exits, me. They didn't mention the war at first. They spoke about my background, where I had studied, languages I knew, places I had lived. I answered honestly, still thinking this was some misunderstanding. Then one of them unfolded a map on my desk. It was marked with lines I recognized immediately. Supply routes, rail lines, borders that shifted weekly. "We need someone who can move through these places without being noticed," he said. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "I want a spy," I said. "I'm a schoolteacher." They exchanged a glance. "No," the other replied. "We want a courier, someone who can observe, remember, walk." Walk. Such a simple word for something that could end a life. They told me what had happened to the last courier, and the one before that. Radios were intercepted, messages compromised, patterns detected. "We need someone new," they said, "someone no one would expect." That was the moment I realized this wasn't a mistake. They were serious. I asked the only question that mattered. "What happens if I say no?" The man didn't hesitate. "Then we find someone else," he said, "and the information may not arrive in time." He didn't say what that meant. He didn't need to. I went home that evening with the map still burned into my mind. I cooked dinner, graded papers, corrected spelling mistakes. Life continued in its ordinary way, and that terrified me more than the war ever had, because ordinary things are what disappear first. I didn't sleep. By morning, I knew my answer. Training was brief, brutally so. They taught me how to observe without staring, how to remember numbers by turning them into stories, how to lie without adding details, how to disappear into crowds. Most importantly, they taught me this: never write anything down. Your mind is safer than paper. The mission itself was simple to explain and impossible to execute. Enemy supply convoys were moving through a corridor no one had been able to map accurately. If the Allies knew exact timing and weak points, an entire offensive could be delayed or stopped. I was to travel alone, cross multiple occupied zones, observe one convoy pattern, memorize everything, then bring the information back. No radio, no backup, no weapons. Just memory. They gave me a new name, papers to match, a dress that made me look forgettable, shoes worn just enough to suggest poverty without drawing pity. "You leave at dawn," they said. No farewell, because farewells create hesitation. I left my classroom keys on the desk, packed nothing I couldn't carry without thinking, and as I stepped onto the train platform, surrounded by strangers pretending not to see one another, it hit me. I might never come back. The train lurched forward, and my old life began to shrink behind me. The first checkpoint was easy, almost insulting. A young soldier barely glanced at my papers before waving me through. The second took longer. The third still. Each one taught me something. Confidence was dangerous. Fear was expected. Neutrality was invisible. By the time I reached enemy-controlled territory, I understood my role. I was not brave. I was unnoticed. The city I entered was heavy with occupation. Soldiers everywhere, banners draped across buildings that were once lively. I rented a room above a bakery where the smell of bread covered everything else. For 3 days, I observed. For 3 nights, I listened. At exactly 0240, the convoy passed. 7 trucks, always 7, guarded tightly at the front, loosely at the third vehicle. Fuel, artillery parts, predictable routes. Predictability is fatal in war. On the 4th night, I followed them, at a distance, not close enough to be seen, not far enough to forget. I counted turns, timed pauses, noted where escort vehicles thinned. This was the heart of the mission, and as I stood in the shadows memorizing the movement that could change everything, I felt something unexpected. Not fear. Clarity. Because now there was no doubt. I was exactly where I needed to be, and there was no turning back. I stayed in the bakery room longer than planned. Not because I wanted to, but because leaving too quickly would have meant someone might notice. Suspicion grows fastest where patterns break suddenly. So I followed routine. Bought bread, spoke little, paid on time. In war, routine is camouflage. Each morning I walked the same streets. Each evening I returned at the same hour. The owner barely looked at me anymore, which meant I had become part of the background. That was when I knew it was time to move. The convoy was predictable, too predictable, and predictability, once discovered, turns lethal. My instructions had been clear. Once I confirmed the pattern, I was to reposition, closer but not close, near enough to confirm vulnerabilities, far enough to disappear if needed. On the 5th night, I changed my route. Not drastically, just enough. Instead of watching from the alley near the rail yard, I moved to a bomb-damaged building closer to the road. From there, I could see the escort vehicles clearly, count the men, note where attention faded. 240. 7 trucks. The third slowed more than the others when the road curved. That was no accident. I stayed still long after they passed, listening to the echo fade. Silence returned slowly, as if the city itself needed time to breathe again. That was when footsteps approached. Not hurried, not careless. Measured. I didn't move. A shadow passed near the doorway. A pause. Then another set of steps joined it. Voices. German. Low. Calm. They were not searching. They were watching. Suspense isn't the fear of being seen. It's the knowledge that you might already be. I waited until they left. Then I waited longer. When I finally moved, my legs felt stiff, my breath shallow. I took a longer route back, doubling behind buildings, crossing streets only when I could blend into others. The bakery door was locked when I arrived. That had never happened before. I knocked once, then again. The owner opened it only a crack. "You should leave," he whispered. "Tonight." I didn't ask why. I packed what little I had, changed clothes, altered my appearance the way I had been taught, small things, hair parted differently, shoes swapped, posture adjusted. I left through the back. The safe route I had memorized was no longer safe. I knew that without being told. The resistance had a saying, "If nothing has changed, something has gone wrong." I moved toward the countryside under cover of darkness, avoiding roads, following hedges and ditches. It was slower, more exhausting, but safer. Near dawn, I reached a farmhouse marked as a temporary shelter. The signal, a cloth tied to a fence, was missing. I didn't approach. Instead, I circled wide and waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. A truck arrived. German. I melted into the ground, breath shallow, heart pounding so loudly I was certain it could be heard. Soldiers entered the farmhouse. Laughter followed, then shouting. The shelter was burned. I watched from a distance as smoke curled into the sky. That was when it became clear. They were closing in. Someone had been captured. Someone had spoken. And now, everyone connected was expendable. I had to move again. The next leg of the mission required crossing into another occupied zone, one known for aggressive patrols and frequent inspections. The route involved a main road I had hoped to avoid, but options disappear quickly in war. I joined a group of displaced civilians moving toward the same direction, families with carts, old men, women carrying too much weight and too little hope. No one asked questions. Shared misery creates unspoken alliances. At the checkpoint, soldiers inspected belongings aggressively. Papers were checked twice. A woman ahead of me was pulled aside for questioning. I did not watch. Watching would have betrayed concern. When it was my turn, the soldier's hands lingered on my documents. He looked at me, then at them again. "Where are you from?" he asked. I told him. "Where are you going?" I shrugged slightly. "Anywhere with work." He studied my face longer than I liked. Then he waved me through. Behind me, I heard the woman crying. I did not turn around. That night I slept in a field. No shelter, no fire. Just the sky and the knowledge that the most dangerous part was still ahead. The intelligence was complete now. Everything I needed lived in my memory. The mission had shifted. Observation was over. Delivery remained. And delivery meant crossing the river. The resistance had warned me about it. The current was strong. The bridges watched. Crossing meant choosing between visibility and survival. I chose survival. The water was colder than I expected. It stole my breath instantly, forcing me to focus on movement alone. I entered diagonally, letting the current carry me downstream while I fought toward the opposite bank. Halfway across, my arms burned. My fingers began to lose feeling. I focused on numbers. 240. 7 trucks. Third vulnerable. Memory became my anchor. When I reached the far side, I collapsed onto the mud, gasping. My clothes clung to me, heavy and freezing. I crawled until my body obeyed again, then forced myself upright. There was no time to rest. Patrols searched riverbanks frequently. I moved inland, toward trees, toward shadow. By morning, I reached Allied-controlled territory. Not safety, but direction. The extraction point was still hours away. I followed markers only someone trained would notice, scratches on posts, stones placed unnaturally. Near midday, I heard an engine. I froze. A truck approached slowly, unmarked. It stopped several meters away. A man stepped out. He didn't raise his voice, didn't approach. "Name?" he asked. I gave the mission name. He nodded once. "That's far enough," he said. Inside the truck, warmth felt unreal. My hands shook violently. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. No one asked questions. Not yet, because surviving the mission mattered more than explaining it. As we drove away, I allowed myself one moment of reflection. Not relief, not pride, just understanding. The mission was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone who would never know it existed. And whatever happened next, the war would feel its impact. The truck stopped just before sunset. No words were exchanged as I climbed down. The man who had picked me up pointed once, toward a line of trees, and then drove away without looking back. That was how these things worked. Minimal contact. No names, no unnecessary memory. I stood there for a moment, listening to the engine fade. This was the final stretch, the place where observation ended and consequence began. The Allied contact was less than 5 miles away, but those miles mattered more than the hundreds I had already crossed. This area was unstable, contested ground, where patrols shifted without warning and loyalties were unclear. I walked, slowly, carefully. Every sound felt amplified. A snapping branch, distant voices, wind moving through leaves. My body reacted before my mind did, tightening, preparing. I reached the rendezvous point just after dark, an abandoned mill near the edge of a village that no longer appeared on maps. The signal was subtle, a lantern placed inside a broken window, light partially covered. I did not approach immediately. Instead, I waited. Suspense is not the act of waiting. It is knowing why you are waiting. After 10 minutes, a figure emerged from the shadows. A woman, older than me, wearing a coat too thin for the night air. She did not speak. She simply turned and walked. I followed. Inside the mill, the air smelled of damp stone and oil. A table stood near the wall. A map lay folded on it, weighed down by a metal cup. "You were late," she said quietly. "I'm alive," I replied. That earned a small nod. "Sit," she said. I did. This was the moment everything led to. No dramatics, no speeches, just memory being transferred from one mind to another. I spoke slowly. 240, 7 trucks, fuel and artillery. Third vehicle slowed on the curve. Escort thin at the bend east of the rail yard. She wrote nothing. She didn't need to. When I finished, she closed her eyes for a brief moment, committing it all to memory. "It's enough," she said. Relief tried to surface. I pushed it down, because relief makes people careless. "You'll stay here tonight," she continued. "Then we move you again." That was when the sound reached us. Engines. Multiple. Too close. The woman's expression changed instantly, not to fear, but calculation. "They're early," she said. That was all. We moved without running, out the back of the mill, through tall grass, toward a ditch that cut across the field like a scar. We slid into it just as headlights swept the area. German trucks. More than before. Search pattern. This was no coincidence. Someone had talked, or someone had guessed correctly. Either way, the mill was compromised. We waited in silence, bodies pressed into cold earth. Mud soaked through my clothes. Insects crawled over my hands. I didn't move. Above us, boots hit gravel. Voices shouted orders. A lantern swung. Light passed over the ditch. Paused. Moved on. Minutes stretched into something heavier. Then the engines started again. The trucks pulled away. We waited longer. When we finally crawled out, my limbs felt disconnected from my body. "That was too close," I said. She looked at me. "That's war," she replied. We didn't return to the mill. Instead, we walked through the night, avoiding roads, moving toward a secondary safe house that had not been used in months. By dawn, we reached it, an old schoolhouse. Empty. Familiar. The irony did not escape me. Inside, the woman lit a small stove. We warmed our hands in silence. "The operation moves tonight," she said. "Your information changed the plan." I nodded. That was the first time I allowed myself to understand the scale of what I had done. This wasn't just about a convoy anymore. It was about timing, momentum, lives. I was told to rest. I tried. Sleep came in fragments. By evening, distant thunder echoed. Not weather, but artillery. The operation had begun. We listened. Each explosion felt personal. I didn't know exactly where the convoy would be hit. I didn't need to. I knew the weakness, the moment, the vulnerability. That was enough. Hours later, a messenger arrived, breathless, eyes bright. "It worked," he said simply. The room didn't erupt. No cheering, just exhalation. The corridor was blocked. The advance stalled. An entire unit delayed. Lives saved. And now, the most dangerous phase began. Aftermath. Victories attract attention, failures demand answers, and the people who make victories possible are often the first ones erased to protect the larger story. I was moved again before sunrise. New clothes, new route, No goodbyes. The woman who had taken my information squeezed my hand once. That was history, she said. Then she turned away. I crossed the final border alone. The checkpoint was heavily guarded. An older officer inspected my papers. His eyes were sharp, experienced. He had seen war long enough to know when something didn't fit. He looked at me, then at my documents, then back at me. I met his gaze. Not challenging, not submissive. Human. After a long moment, he handed the papers back. "Go," he said. I walked, did not run, did not look back. When I crossed into safety, there was no clear line, no sign announcing it. Just a feeling, subtle, unfamiliar. The feeling of being able to breathe again. The debriefing came later. Long, thorough, quiet. They asked everything. I gave them only what they needed. When it was done, one of them said, "You'll go home." Home. The word felt strange, as if it belonged to someone else. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without boots on. And when I woke, the war had shifted. Not ended, but changed, because of a mission no one would ever talk about, and a woman most people would never know existed. They greeted me politely. No one asked where I had been. That, too, was a kindness. I resumed lessons as if nothing had interrupted them. Rivers flowed, borders existed, trade routes connected distant places. Only I knew how easily all of it could collapse. Sometimes, while drawing a route on the board, my hand would pause. A familiar curve, a remembered bend in a road. I would finish the line anyway, because the past had no place on the chalkboard. Life settled into routine again. Mornings in the classroom, afternoons preparing lessons, evenings spent reading or walking through streets slowly returning to normal. The war, they said, was nearing its end. When it finally did, the city celebrated. People filled the streets. Flags appeared where there had once been warnings. Music replaced sirens. Strangers embraced. I stood among them briefly, then stepped aside. Victory felt distant. Not hollow, just private, because I knew how many victories never made it to the streets. Weeks later, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside, a single line. The corridor never reopened. I folded the paper and burned it. That chapter was closed. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself in pieces. New governments, new promises, new fears replacing old ones. My students grew older. Some left, some stayed. Some asked questions about the war. I answered carefully. History, I learned, is not about telling everything. It's about choosing what matters. I never spoke about my role, not because I was afraid, but because speaking would have changed it. The mission worked because it was invisible. Making it visible now would only distort it. One afternoon, long after the war had officially ended, a man waited for me outside the school. Older, thinner, familiar in a way that made me uneasy. "Miss Hayes?" he said. "Yes." "I don't think you remember me." I did. He had been at the debriefing, silent, observant. "We're closing files, final ones." I understood. He didn't ask me questions. He simply confirmed details I already knew he had. At the end, he said, "History will record the outcome, not the method." "That's enough," I replied. He smiled faintly. "It usually is." When he left, I went back inside and finished grading papers. Life does not pause for closure. Eventually, I retired. Students visited, thanked me for patience I did not remember giving, for lessons that stayed with them. I listened. I smiled. I said nothing. Because the most important lesson I ever taught was never spoken aloud. It was this. Sometimes the people who change the world do so quietly, without recognition, without reward. They return to their lives carrying what they've done not as pride, but as responsibility. I lived long enough to see borders change again, to see history repeat itself in different forms. And every time it did, I remembered how fragile everything truly is. The war had taken years from my life, but it had also shown me something lasting, that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it walks calmly through danger, and then goes home to teach children how the world works. I retired quietly. No speeches, no ceremony. One day I stood at the front of the classroom for the last time, chalk dust on my fingers, and realized that this ordinary moment, was something I had once risked my life to protect. The students applauded politely. Some smiled, some looked relieved, a few seemed unsure what came next. I understood that feeling well. After retirement, my days slowed in a way that felt unfamiliar at first. Mornings without bells, evenings without papers to grade, time stretched out, unstructured and patient. It took effort to learn how to live inside it. I walked more, read more, watched the city change as years passed. Buildings replaced ruins. Children who had never known war grew up believing peace was permanent. I hoped they were right. Sometimes former students visited. They brought stories of their own lives, careers, families, disappointments, small victories. They thanked me for lessons that had stayed with them. Maps, mostly. I smiled at that. Because maps are never just about places. They're about choices, about which lines matter and which ones can be crossed. As I grew older, my body slowed, but my memory did not. Certain details remained sharp, untouched by time. A curve in a road, the sound of engines at night, the weight of wet clothes after crossing a river that should have killed me. I never dreamed about the war. That surprised people when I admitted it. But the truth is, nightmares belong to moments that end badly. Mine did not. One afternoon, long after the world had moved on, I received a small package. No name, no address. Inside was a book, a history text. I recognized the chapter immediately. It described an operation that had stalled an enemy advance. It spoke of intelligence delivered through unknown channels. It listed outcomes, dates, consequences. No names, no faces. No mention of how fragile that success had been. I closed the book and set it aside. That was enough. Because history does not need my voice to be true. It needs outcomes. And the outcome had already happened. In my later years, I spent more time alone. Not lonely, just quiet. I found comfort in routines. Tea in the afternoon, short walks in the evening, sitting by the window when the light softened. Sometimes I watched people hurry past and wondered what invisible battles they carried. Everyone carries something. That is what war teaches you most clearly. Toward the end, my hands began to shake. Writing became difficult. I adapted, dictated notes to myself that I never kept, thoughts I never planned to share. But one night, something changed. I was sorting through old things when I found a folded piece of paper at the bottom of a drawer, yellowed, fragile. A map. Not the one they had shown me. My own, drawn from memory years after the war, then forgotten. Routes, borders, a river marked with a simple line. I studied it for a long time, not with nostalgia, with recognition. That map had once been my entire world, and now it was nothing more than paper. I burned it, not because it was dangerous, but because I no longer needed it. On my last birthday, a former colleague visited. We talked about ordinary things. The weather, the state of the world, how quickly everything seemed to move now. Before leaving, she paused. You lived through something important, didn't you? She asked gently. It wasn't an accusation, just curiosity. I considered my answer carefully. Yes, I said. She waited. That's all? She asked. I smiled. That's all.